finally going after the Houthis in the Red Sea in Yemen in a way that his predecessor hadn't was important. But I say all this because I think it strengthens the overall criticism. I don't think anyone can accuse me of having, TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, but I'm seeing these first 100 days as the most disastrous first 100 days of any presidency that I can think of. And that probably goes for the Lincoln administration as well, when you had 11 states of the Confederacy secede.
Bret, let's talk about the border because you see this as a success politically and practically for the president. Theoretically, could this have been done without the kind of acerbic rhetoric that Trump uses? Or was this a necessary approach to so frighten people off from attempting to cross that that was the only way to control?
Well, that's a question that I can't give you a perfect answer to because we'll never know. I mean, but I think there's no question that the rhetoric that Trump employed um, allowed him to accomplish what would have required uh, masses of manpower to accomplish without that rhetoric. And that's it's important to acknowledge that we had a crisis at the American border, which became apparent to you guys in California, I think, much sooner than it did to us in New York. But as I walk the streets of New York City and see homeless migrants on the streets in a way that reminds me of my hometown of Mexico City, it's a vivid reminder of what uncontrolled migration means in the real world and its effects. And I'm a great proponent of legal immigration. Its effects have not been good, not least, Larry. That issue did more to turbocharge the far right in the United States than any other one.
Let's talk about Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency that
Yeah.
Elon Musk has headed. As a conservative, I assume you think it's a good thing to try and rein in government spending, to make government more efficient, to try and diminish the power of career people in the government who aren't necessarily as responsive to where the majority of Americans might be. But when you look at how Doge has carried this out, has it in fact actually done damage to those conservative ideals of cutting the size and power of the federal government?
Oh, sure. I mean, obviously, there are all kinds of ways to judiciously pair a government that is just a leviathan, a behemoth. And I would have welcomed an effort, actually not unlike what Al Gore was able to achieve with his efforts to reform government in the both the first and second Clinton administrations, if it was done smartly, fairly, with regard to the lives and livelihoods of people in public service who deserved better than curt emails telling them that they were laid off yesterday. The What Doge ended up achieving was the worst of both worlds. It really cut very little in terms of the overall scope of government, but it gave that kind of cutting a really bad name, so that in the future it's going to be that much harder for a more reasonable president to prune an overgrown government. It was a real missed opportunity.
I can't cite a literal statement to this effect, but my sense of those supporting Doge's approach is, yeah, it might have been somewhat ham-handed and very insensitive to those government employees who dedicated their careers to their work, but that something this extreme was necessary, that taking that Al Gore approach, that going through traditional channels to try and pare down the size of government would give so much ability for opponents of it to come back and fight against it, that little would have been accomplished, that this sort of shot across the bow was really necessary. What's your response to that
Well,
argument?
I understand that, but the truth is that I think some of these cases are going to tie up the federal government in litigation that's going to last a decade and is probably going to cost federal taxpayers more than anything that Doge saved. The other aspect of Doge, which really is important to note, is that items like USAID are blips in the overall federal budget. And you can argue you can make the case that there are all kinds of inefficiencies in the way in which the United States distributes foreign aid, and we could do it much more competently. But if you really want to get at what's driving federal spending, it's what you might call the entitlement spending in Medicaid and the permanent programs that need to be reformed. So if the president had really wanted to do something transformative, making the case legislatively, for example, that we have to gradually raise the retirement age so that Social Security benefits are paid out later, people work longer to take account of longer lifespans today than during the Depression era. That would have been brave and right, and I would have supported it. But simply going in with a literal chainsaw and hacking away this or that department of or agency in the State Department, or firing a bunch of IRS employees, which, by the way, will just delay your tax refund. It won't actually make government more efficient. I think was just absolutely dreadful. And I've been saying before it was cool that Elon Musk is, as I called him, the Donald Trump of Silicon Valley, a con man with a cult. And I'm glad some of my liberal friends are catching up to what I was saying many years ago.
So let's talk about USAID as an example. It may be financially a blip in terms of federal spending, but my sense is that really much of that was of going after USAID was ideologically the
Yeah.
idea this is an agency full of liberals. They have a real internationalist worldview. They really don't care. I'm putting this in their characterization. They really don't care that much about the U.S. per se. Their hearts are with the globalist community, and that's what motivates that action. Do you think that that's the case?
I happen to know a great deal about USAID. I wrote about their programs in Afghanistan, many of which were failures. I wrote about their programs in Ukraine. I accompanied Samantha Power, the last administrator, to Ukraine in the summer of 2023, and I saw that USAID in an area like that actually could do a lot of good. I also saw that some of our people in the field are courageous Americans who are going out to far-flung places and putting their lives on the line for the sake of doing good. Are they liberal bleeding hearts? I didn't give them a political quiz when I was out there. I saw them as American patriots doing their best in advancing, soft American power and achieving humanitarian aims. Now, there's no question that in all kinds of way, a lot of money is misspent. A lot of what USAID does is distribute money to companies in the Beltway, the so-called Beltway bandits that have shall we say, variable degrees of competence in terms of distributing aid in other countries. And you can look to all kinds of cases where USAID fails. But there are also other cases where it succeeds and where it becomes an arm, a very valuable arm of American power. And I mentioned Ukraine. It did a tremendous amount of good there in helping Ukrainians get their goods to international markets, rebuilding, clearing minefields. You name it. There was a lot of good there.
So why is it you think that President Trump and those in his orbit don't see it that way? Is this because those people don't think the way we do, or what? I'm trying to get at what drives that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that it's been an ideological hobby horse of the far right to get rid of USAID as a kind of example of American overstretch and a strain on the budget, money being spent in, I don't know, Congo that should be spent in Chicago, say. There's that ideological view. I think there's no doubt that it was seen as a kind of, especially in Washington, it was seen as an ideological opponent of the president. And this is an administration in which loyalty is the premier virtue, personal loyalty to the president and to his agenda. And I think they thought that it would be politically costless that even Americans who, in theory supported something like USAID wouldn't consider it a political red line. It would be considered an example of the president doing what he promised to do.
You were talking about Social Security and entitlement programs being where the real money
Yeah.
is. Medicaid, what we call Medi-Cal in California, is another area where there's a tremendous amount spent. It's grown sizably since the start of the pandemic. Eligibility has shifted to allow many more people to enroll in Medicaid slash Medi-Cal. Undocumented Californians are eligible to be able to sign up. California has, I think, a 6% uninsured rate, the lowest that we've ever had in California between the Affordable Care Act and the state exchange and Medi-Cal. But for Republicans in Congress and for the president, they want to significantly restrain Medicaid spending. So where do you think we're really headed for that? Particularly that this is politically fraught for some Republicans in
Yeah.
Congress who have constituencies that heavily use Medicaid.
Well, there is no doubt that Medicaid and Medicare have uh, hundreds of billions of dollars in fraudulent billing, wasteful spending. That would have been a really good area in which a competent administration could have brought together really top-notch people to look at how you pare those programs down in a sensible, measured way, and how you do it by persuading Americans that if they want to keep these programs in the long term, they have to be put on a path towards long-term financial solvency, which is, I understand it, they're not on that path. But the president is a big, even though people call Trump a conservative, he's not. He's a big government guy who doesn't want to alienate a constituency that he believes is crucial to the future of the Republican Party, working class Americans. And so um, programs like Medicare and Medicaid are probably not going to be touched. And it's one of the many ways, Larry, in which I feel like I'm in an Alice in Wonderland world observing today's Republican Party, because the Republican Party I became enthusiastic about as a teenager, Ronald Reagan's party, believed in free trade, believed in international alliances, believed in the value of immigration and in the importance of comprehensive immigration reform, believed in institutions like NATO, fought and opposed the Russians, didn't collapse in the face of the Russians. I've been on one issue after another, and at least in speech, wanted to pare the size of government. And in every respect, this is a kind of opposite stand party that I'm seeing in the Republican
Well,
Party.
well, so Bret, did rank and file Republicans not really believe in those things? There were other aspects of Republicanism, crack down on those protesters, or look what's happening with crime in my name. Were those really for rank? I'm not talking about Republican intellectuals, Republican readers, op-ed writers. But for rank and file Republicans, were they never really into these conservative economic and trade issues? So for them to go for Trump, it wasn't really abandoning something, or was there, in fact, a shift in point of view among Republicans generationally?
Well, I'm always fond of that quote attributed to Groucho Marx. These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. And I think that's sort of what happened to many rank and file Republicans who were all about the Reagan agenda until they discovered that there were other principles and they were all about them. I think it's a combination of factors, Larry. I think to some extent, there's no doubt that the challenges of the 2020s are very different from the challenges of the 1980s. And so the Republican Party had to evolve. The second thing was there was a political opportunity to capture a lot of working class voters who had become disaffected with the Democratic Party, which they saw as increasingly elitist, coastal, removed from many of their concerns. The third factor is that what I think of as conservatism, which really is an outgrowth of a certain kind of liberal tradition, is can be confused with a certain kind of illiberalism, which is just about wanting to own the libs, hate your opponents. But the most important factor is that the Republican Party, as I see it, went from being a party to being a cult. And it's a cult ruled over by a very stern and angry master, Donald Trump, who is wielding power in highly personal and vindictive ways to impose his will on politicians who almost are by definition cowards because their job depends on popularity and the good opinion of their party leader.
Brett, let's go back to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You gave President Trump praise for him pushing back on this in academia, in governmental organizations, even pressuring in the private sector firms over their DEI programs if there's any link to federal funding or contracts. But are you at all concerned that in some ways the push by this administration has been so extreme and has encroached on areas of free speech to such a degree that it's actually made extreme DEI ideology? I'm not talking about, including people, being welcoming, encouraging diverse workforces, but the kind of hardcore ideology, left ideology that's often associated with DEI. Are you worried that it's actually made that sympathetic?
Well, that's an excellent point, Larry. And last year, when I was making the case, I wrote a column called "The Republican Case Against Trump." It's a number of columns on that score. One of the points that I made is that Trump will do more to turbocharge the forces of wokeness, if you will, which include support for DEI, than he will to eliminate them, because Trump always goes overboard. That is his style. But I want to say this. Let me make 2 points. When I'm talking about DEI, I want to draw a bright line between DEI, which is fundamentally an effort to achieve equal outcomes, with my firm belief in civil rights and civil liberties and a commitment to equal opportunities. And I think the original civil rights movement was hijacked in the last few years by so-called DEI practitioners who substituted this word equality with the word equity, and insisted on constantly racializing every conversation in a way that I think was not only toxic, it was ineffective. One of my colleagues on the news side of the New York Times, Nick Confessori, did a big piece about how DEI worked out at the University of Michigan. And the answer is it didn't work out. It didn't work out at all. That being said, your point is really well taken, because Trump always goes too far. And I fear that he is, even on the issues where I think he's pressing in the right direction, he's doing it in such a ham-fisted and incompetent way that it's going to do damage to his own side. Another great example of that is the effort to bend universities to his will, purportedly on account of anti-Semitism. Now, no one was more horrified than I by the explosion of naked anti-Semitism or thinly disguised anti-Semitism on campuses like UCLA, Berkeley, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, and so on. But I think what Trump is now doing now, or what he's doing now by, cutting off funding for, I don't know, basic medical research, stuff like that, is actually harming the cause of addressing anti-Semitism on this campus rather than helping it.
Do you think, I mean, we've got a theme here. Doge actually hurting the effort to try and rein in and make government more efficient. Going after DEI in the way is potentially leading to a backlash and people siding with the DEI ideology. We have in Canada the Liberal Party being resurgent because of Trump's attacks on Canada.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are all these sort of opposite reactions that the first 100 days of this presidency has engendered. And Do you think Trump supporters see this? If they really believe in the causes that the president is espousing and acting for, do they see the sort of boomerang effect of those actions?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between two kinds of Trump supporters, Larry. There's sort of the hardcore MAGA, which is going to support him no matter what. But then there are people who come from kind of the business minded side of the traditional Republican Party who who didn't think President Biden was mentally fit, who thought that Vice President Harris was way too extreme and had a bad track record and was kind of a California progressive, voted for Trump thinking they were going to get something like Trump 1.0, and then are suddenly discovering that Trump 2.0 is very different. The president isn't being reined in by competent advisors. He's not consulting with Congress. He is governing by executive order and social media post. And I think those are the voters, and there are a critical mass of Republicans who are really turning swiftly away from the president. And no issue is doing more damage to the president among those voters than the tariffs. If you are a person who runs a medium sized business, and I profiled one such person in my column today, you are being hammered not only by ridiculously high tariffs, but by a climate of total business uncertainty. It is complete amateur hour at the Commerce Department, at the Treasury, in the White House. And these are the Republicans that ultimately Trump and the Republican Party need to win. He's losing them.
And in that column, the man that you quote, who makes these customized board games, sounds like a very interesting business. He said he still, if he had it to do over again, would vote for Trump because not, recognizing all the damage that he thinks Trump has done to his business because of how unfit that he thought Kamala Harris and Democratic policies are. So it didn't necessarily shift the way he would vote if he had it to do
Well,
over
you
again.
know, I had an extensive interview with him, so I couldn't include every quote. But one thing that came across clearly is that he's not going to stick for Trump with Trump very much longer if this tariff regime and this style of economic policymaking goes on. And I think it's very important to note. I was reading the comments on that column, and they were so angry with Dane. You know, how dare you? This is my friend Dane, whom I profiled. How dare you voted for Trump? I think people had honorable, perfectly acceptable reasons to vote the way they did. It's a free country. And I think those of us who are critics of the president should look to people like my friend Dane and say, now you see our point. Let's work to find democratic alternatives who look less like Kamala Harris or AOC or Bernie Sanders, and more like that moderate strain of Democrats, Seth Moulton in Massachusetts, Richie Torres in New York, John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, Roy Cooper in North Carolina, a whole world of Andy Beshear in Kentucky, whole world of Democrats who want to make America normal again. And I think that's the hat the Democrats should be wearing. Manna from heaven, make America normal again.
Can Democrats, if that's the right approach, do you think Democrats can really get there? Because here we got the stars of the party who are out doing their show across the country is 80 something Bernie Sanders, one of the younger members of Congress, AOC. Two of them are farthest to the left members of Congress. They're the ones who get the media attention. They're the ones who get the crowds. Is it possible for moderates like you're mentioning to break through in this world?
By the way, someone I forgot to mention is Ro Khanna from your own state, who I think is really an exceptionally thoughtful
Silicon Valley. Yeah. Yeah.
Silicon Valley Democrat. Went to the University of Chicago a couple years behind me. Really bright guy. Must have been the University of Chicago that
Well, you have to be
really
bright to get into the University of Chicago. But yeah.
well. He's also a terrific person. So there are a lot of people, but I think the Democrats are going to need to have a little civil war, an important civil war in their party between the AOC Bernie wing and the Seth Moulton Andy Beshear wing. They have to decide whether they want to essentially imitate Trump's polarizing strategy, radicalize and rally a left liberal base, and hope that through kind of a turnout model, they can create momentum on the Democratic side. Or is the model to appeal to the center of the country that just wants a much more moderate, predictable, stable type of government that doesn't eat up their lives? And you know, the Democrats had this fight back in the 1980s and 1990s, early 90s, and I'm glad that the Bill Clinton wing of the party won that fight, and they went on to have a presidency that produced, you know, one of the best economic results, the Clinton presidency, and achieved a lot of significant bipartisan legislation. So the model, minus, you know, the personal peccadillos, to me, is the Bill Clinton model. It's not the Bernie AOC model.
You know, Democrats have been challenging and they've been fighting the president, going back through the campaign, calling him fascist, anti-democratic, autocratic, racist. But all of these sort of, you know, umbrella arguments against Trump and his character were not able to carry the majority of voters. And you know, here we have the administration, you know, some supporters of Trump very happy and don't mind the chaos and feel like he's accomplishing things despite all the back and forth that's going on with the administration. But why do you think Democrats have gone to these sort of overarching character arguments, which don't seem to move people beyond who've already made that character assessment, and go after the sort of governing arguments, the competency arguments, the chaos, and not emphasize that?
My advice to Democrats listening to this show of ours, Larry, is don't oppose, propose. Remember, there's only one political movement in America less popular than Donald Trump and MAGA, and that's the Democratic Party today. And that is because too much of it, and this continues now, sort of pursues a style of sort of hair on fire politics that seems to, I think, a lot of Americans as over the top. We can argue that, but I think many Americans are like, well, you know, life is kind of the same. You know, I'm sorry about this guy who's in El Salvador. That seems wrong. You know, that's the way I think flyover country America is thinking. And I think what uh, flyover country America, that's a caricature, I realize, but what they want to hear from Democrats is a series of proposals about how life becomes better under them and how what they are offering is better than what Kamala Harris was able to offer, and whether the Democrats can demonstrate that they learned their lessons. And one of the things Trump is very good at doing with a bully's instinct is goading his opponents into making the same stupid mistakes they made before. The Democrats were saying exactly this about Trump in 2016. He won. 2020 was different, I think, in part because of COVID and because Democrats nominated the most moderate candidate that year. But 2024, it was the same thing. Kamala Harris called Donald Trump a fascist in her town hall with, I think it was Anderson Cooper. And the moment she said that, I said to myself, she's lost the election right there, because name calling is not a successful way of winning an election. She had to have a better agenda. She couldn't articulate one other than Trump is, Trump is Hitler all over again.
The Democrats were severely handicapped by having Joe Biden drop out so late, and then he chooses Kamala Harris to be his designated successor, and everybody quickly coalesces around her. There's a question of, you know, why people who were aware of Joe Biden and what he was going through didn't earlier on say, hey, we need to convince him to step aside, get a bunch of candidates out there, do a full primary, and you know, allow people to compete and see who rises to the top. But you know, setting that aside, so the party's going to have an opportunity, of course, to do this in 2.5 more years or whatever. And when you look at the field of Democrats, do you think that the party is going to be able to sort itself out through that primary campaign?
Look, as Niels Bohr, the physicist, once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. What I do know is that what happened in 2024 was a disgrace. And what I mean is that the Democratic Party, in my view, leaders of the Democratic Party lied to the American people about President Biden's fitness to serve a second term. And they did so with the connivance of many allies in the media. I use the word connivance advisedly. I don't know if it was a conspiracy, and maybe they weren't lying. Maybe they managed to persuade themselves, but they deceived the American public in a way that made, I think, many Americans feel gaslighted. I wrote my first column, you can look this up, in 2021 that says Biden should not run again and he should say so. And year after year after year, I would make this point in my conversations with Gail Collins and in other columns I'd written. And Democrats kept saying, no, he's completely fine. Everything is A-OK. And what that told me was that the Democratic Party was more interested in deceiving itself and being interested in deceiving ordinary Americans than it was in showing the political courage to go to the president and say, Mr. President, you're a great American. You've served this country with honor for over 50 years. You said you were going to be a transitional president. You have to be a transitional president.
Well, it also undercut
Nancy
the argument.
Pelosi failed to do that. Chuck Schumer, until it was too late, failed to do that. All the other party leaders, except one congressman from Minnesota, Dean Phillips, who had the guts to challenge the president. And so Democrats have to come to grips with that colossal failure on their part to show some political courage.
And you could also argue it undercut the argument of what the stakes were in the presidential
Yeah.
election. It undercut the argument Democrats were making about what a Trump presidency would mean. But in terms of journalists, I just want to push back on that, Bret, because I think the access that even White House reporters got to the president was so carefully controlled and limited, and that President Biden could, in more limited sorts of highly controlled settings, come across as age not taking the toll that it had at that point. So, I mean, is it really fair to say that they were complicit with those closest to the
Absolutely.
president?
Absolutely. So what made me so brilliantly, I mean, I'm a journalist. What made me so brilliantly clairvoyant that I could see this in 2021, that the president's stumbles were highly reminiscent of very beloved relatives of mine in the early stages of mental decline. I don't know whether it leads to exactly what the diagnosis is, but any of us who have had elderly relatives in those early stages of mental decline see those symptoms. And I was repeatedly, reliably informed by people in the administration or people who had interactions with the president or journalists who had interactions with the president or fundraisers who had interactions with the president that they were shocked by the extent to which the president needed micromanaging to get from one place to another, to remember the names of longtime friends and prominent contributors. Why did all of this only come out in late June after that disastrous debate when there was this sudden stampede? The idea that this was a mystery to any journalist is just baloney. And I'm old enough to remember the 1980s when certainly in 1984, there was very loud skepticism among journalists about whether Ronald Reagan was fit enough for a second term. In fact, he was asked that question famously in a second debate with Walter Mondale, and he came back with a clearly canned but very witty riposte and put that issue to one side. People were asking this about Donald Trump in his first term. You remember when he seemed to have trouble walking down from a dais at West Point?
Yeah.
Journalists talked about that loudly. And we have to also confront the fact that there are too many journalists who seem to think that their role is to protect a Democratic administration from its Republican opponents. That's not our role as journalists. It's to call balls and strikes.
I have so many more questions for you, but let's go to our audience questions because they're always outstanding. We begin with Carol, who says, what do you make of the minerals deal that was made between the US and Ukraine announced just before we came on the air with this program tonight?
Look, the first pass answer is it's shameful. We're not in the business of, America should not be in the business of advancing our strategic interests by strong arming desperate allies into handing over valuable resources. On the other hand, if that's what it takes for this administration to continue to provide arms, critical arms and intelligence to the Ukrainians, it's a pill I'm willing to swallow because the collapse of Ukraine in the face of Russian power would be a catastrophe for the Ukrainians, but a strategic disaster for Europe and the United States. So if that's the deal, I will. It ain't Churchillian, it ain't Rooseveltian, but it's one I'm willing to accept as the price for Trump's support.
Steve in Los Angeles says, hadn't President Biden created a coalition to attack the Houthis? So, how do you distinguish between President Biden's and President Trump's responses?
It's very simple. It's the number of sorties, the aggressiveness of the attacks that we've seen now, the targeting without warning of Houthi infrastructure. I mean, the Houthis are very, like Hamas in Gaza. They've clearly done a good job of burying missiles and other equipment to make it hard to get to. But I think anyone will tell you that this strike is this series of strikes over the last month or so have been much more persistent and intense and perhaps effective than what the Biden administration was doing, which was really a very calibrated tit for tat response. So Biden had the right idea, but execution is what counts in war, not just the idea.
Doug asks, how should Jewish organizations and leaders respond to the letters to Barnard and Columbia professors asking about their religion and religious practices? Does this remind you of 1933 Germany?
Again, I hate these comparisons to Germany because they always obscure more than they illuminate. All I'm going to say is that as someone who vehemently opposed the anti-Semitism and the acquiescence to anti-Semitism at elite campuses, this is an assault on academic freedom. Academic freedom is a core liberal value, and I believe it is an important Jewish value as well. And I don't think, and I've said this for many years, that Jews should try to fight anti-Semitism through the tools of illiberalism. We should advance, and by illiberalism, I mean the suppression of multiple perspectives, including perspectives that we vehemently oppose. We should be for a liberal order. And that means academic freedom, including for professors who are on very different sides from us. And I think that's just a core principle for all Americans, but particularly for Jews, because the liberal society has been one in which we've been able to flourish.
We've had a number of viewers who've asked you to elaborate on what you see as Trump's successes in reining in a DEI ideology, because he's gone well beyond saying, we shouldn't be doing programs that prioritize racial identity over other things. Or that we should assure equitable outcomes as opposed to equality of opportunity. They point out that the head of the Joint Chiefs was fired because he was assumed to have been chosen as a result of DEI. There have been books that have been removed because that they have a particular racial community or ethnic community that are highlighted in the book. You mentioned about research grants being canceled, and you've stated your opposition to that. But for instance, so what parts of DEI do you think that Trump's actions have corresponded to or not?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the idea that the Naval Academy is removing novels by Maya Angelou or books by Maya Angelou is absurd, illiberal, wrong-headed, and stupid. And it is an excess. It is one of the very typical excesses and overreaches of the administration and people who are seeking to please the administration. That being said, okay, that being said, the way in which race and gender became, in so many instances, the dominant consideration in terms of career advancement through the federal government, the way in which it became went from being a well-intended effort to help minority communities to a kind of highly polarizing, highly ideological system of favoring and disfavoring people according to their identities. You have to have experienced it to understand it. And having lived through a number of DEI trainings in my roles as an employer or as a board member, this was something that was ripped out of the far left of American academia and imposed across the board. It became onerous, and it actually created so much more resentment than it resolved. Um,
But I was
so
just going to say, yeah, but Bret,
the
that
answer is, of
resentment,
course,
yeah.
this administration is going overboard in all respects, but I did initially give it credit for saying this set of programs favoring people because he was the first this or she was the first that. That impulse, I think, is the right one. I wish it were being carried out by a much more prudent administration.
Well, here's the irony. So you're describing all these initiatives on race and ethnicity and equity that created a backlash against it. And now we have many of these actions by Trump creating a backlash against attempting to rein in DEI.
Right, and a good administration, a prudent steward of the country, would say the goals of civil rights are central to our administration, but whatever DEI claims to be, that's not it. And this administration simply can't do it because it doesn't believe in creating a more just society. It simply believes in turning tables on its enemies.
Beth asks, can we ever really recover from all the cuts that Doge has made, especially cuts to important departments and top federal employees that help keep us safe and who have ended up leaving and might well not come back, even if some jobs are restored?
We've recovered from worse. And, one of the points that I keep making, because I think there's a level of alarm now, is that the United States has been in worse spots. We've had presidents who have committed worse deeds. Um, you know, I think it was Adam Smith who in 1777 or 78, after the Battle of Saratoga, was told that Britain was ruined because they couldn't hold on to their colonies, and he famously said, "There's a lot of ruin in a nation." And his point was that at any given time, there's a lot of ruin, there's a lot that needs to be repaired. But I always hark back, Larry, to that wonderful line in Bill Clinton's first inaugural. He said, "There's nothing wrong in America that can't be solved by what's right in America." And I hold on to that view. No damage is going to be irreparable.
Several viewers have asked about an action I had not heard of previously. Apparently, there were members of the board of the Holocaust Museum who were removed from the board by President Trump. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the
Yes,
people
including
asking
Doug
for your,
Emhoff.
yeah, so your response to that.
Well, it's part of the same vindictive loyalty first mentality that is stretching into all kinds of corners of the government, and it's a terrible shame because it means that in this administration there is simply no room for any kind of outreach to the loyal opposition. In America, we don't treat our political opponents as enemies, or we didn't until this guy came into town. And I think that is one of the many things that I just fundamentally object to in this administration.
A number of viewers have asked, including Ron and Susan, what is the evidence there are billions of dollars of fraud and waste in Medicaid and Medi-Cal?
Oh, there have been, look it up. There have been very reputable studies. I think the Government Accountability Office, but all kinds of highly reputable studies looking into billions of dollars worth of questionable payments or fraudulent payments. I don't have the data on hand, but I'm not that's not some Trumpian talking point. I think that's a well-established fact.
Well, and there are many people, in fact, prosecuted. As a journalist, I get every Friday these releases from the U.S. Department of Justice, and there are many prosecutions for fraud carried out and plea deals reached on
Of course, and
Medicare
for
and
every
Medicaid.
prosecution, there are many people who get away with it, and or many more people who get away with it. And by the way, that should be a cause for Democrats. I think they should say we do want to get rid of billions of dollars of wasteful spending because that's money that's being denied to genuinely needy people for the sake of greedy people. So one of there is room there. Look, this is an important point, Larry. Demagogues like Trump succeed not simply because they traffic in lies. They succeed because they traffic in half truths. And the best way to oppose a demagogue isn't to say, well, everything you say is a lie. It's to say, yeah, there's a legitimate grievance there, but the solution you're proposing is horrific. It was not a lie that there was a crisis at the border. If anything, the Biden administration kept pretending there wasn't a crisis at the border. But how you deal with it is another story. It's not a lie that government has grown way too large, never mind in our lifetime, just in the last 10 years. We have a 7.6, $7.8 trillion government. We're spending more on interest payments on our debt than we are on defense every year. These are real issues. So you have to take the real issue that the demagogue is playing on, but come up with genuine solutions, not demagogic ones.
Suzanne asks, will our relationship with Europe ever return to pre-Trump days, or has the president permanently damaged that relationship?
Well, again, I hate the word permanent. All kinds of things are repaired. I think Europeans will now look with much greater skepticism at the United States. I think to some extent there's a silver lining because they'll realize that they can't simply outsource their defense budgets to America, and they have to contribute their fair share to the common defense of NATO. But certainly these days, I was just in Paris last week. The French are feeling vindicated in de Gaulle's decision to to get out of NATO and develop an independent nuclear deterrent, the force de frappe, because they've always said, you can never truly rely on the Americans, and Trump has given them an argument. But that can always change, depends on the next president.
This came from a viewer, do you think that Trump will be able to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran?
No, I don't think so, because unless Trump ends up negotiating something that looks identical to what I thought was a very flawed deal 10 years ago between the Obama administration and Iran, because the gap between the U.S. demand for a verifiable and permanent dismantling of Iran's capability to produce high enriched uranium and Iran's willingness to really do that, I don't think is bridgeable. But I think the Iranians are going to try to string this administration along for as long as possible.
Gary asks, are you worried that certain members of the cabinet, such as Pete Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard, may be so damaging to our defense and intelligence that the country may be severely compromised for years to come?
Well, hang on a second. I have a notice on Signal. I see what. No, I'm just kidding. Well, these are two people who should not be, to say the least, in the positions they're in. And we really have kind of a degree of clownishness, certainly in the Defense Department. On the other hand, remember, these are huge institutions. Secretaries of Defense come and go. I would challenge almost anyone listening to this broadcast to name the last, say, 6 secretaries of defense. See if you can remember who Donald Trump's last Sec Def was. I bet you can't. And the bureaucracies, because they're very large, are very deep. And so the institutional work sort of happens according to its own logic, irrespective of the fact that the guy who's in charge of it is a world-class clown.
We have several viewers who've asked, do you think that the chaos in these first 100 days and the back and forth with Trump is representative of him having a cognitive decline, or is his behavior consistent with how he has been throughout his life?
I don't see any evidence of Trump's alleged cognitive decline. I mean, I can think of many things to say about his behavior, but I don't think it's cognitive decline. He's not conducting an administration, Larry. He is orchestrating a television show. And every single day, there's something to get people whipped into a frenzy. I mean, I will never forget at the end of the Zelensky meeting, that terrible meeting on the 40th day of his administration, the last thing he said to Zelensky is, well, this is going to make great television. So that seems to me the main issue.
Sarah asked, do you think that we'll have to be concerned about free and unmanipulated elections in the upcoming midterms?
I hope not, but I tend to think that we will not. The As we know, the 2024 election was clean, and guess what? The 2020 election was clean too. Trump's claims to the contrary, notwithstanding. Look, one point that I think is important to make in these last few minutes, Larry, is we are not the Weimar Republic or Russia under Yeltsin, some kind of precarious, shallow democracy in a society with profound autocratic roots. We are a 250-year-old thriving democracy, and we have had terrible administrations in the past, presidents who have committed unforgivable acts. FDR interned 130,000 loyal Japanese American citizens. Andrew Jackson forcibly and illegally moved the Cherokee Nation out of Georgia in defiance of a Supreme Court decision. We had the crisis of the House divided. We had the Dred Scott decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. We have survived a lot as a nation. And I have an abiding faith that we will survive this too. What we have to do is be thoughtful. We have to have an eye on history. And above all, we have to have conversations like the ones we're having now about our civic health and our civic future. I fundamentally believe in the good sense of most Americans.
Steve asked, given that Democrats don't really have an official leader at this point, how do you suggest the party develop and articulate the kinds of proposals that you're asking for? Because there really, Steve points out, there isn't really a mechanism to put forward ideas before you get into a presidential race and have a candidate.
Well, in the 1980s, late 1980s, after the loss of Carter and then Mondale and then Dukakis, you had very serious Democratic intellectuals come around the Democratic Leadership Council, which Bill Clinton was involved with, Al Gore was involved with. Will Marshall was kind of the leading Democratic intellectual. There's a lot of interesting intellectual ferment in the Democratic Party, and creating an institutional mechanism that will capture some of that wisdom is really important. And I hear, Ro Khanna had a great editorial in the New York Times or an op-ed in the New York Times touching on some of these themes. There has to be a mechanism, a vehicle that becomes the kind of brains of a new Democratic Party that is willing to, again, propose rather than merely oppose. And if the Democrats can do that, they can have a winning ticket.
We've had viewers, Paul, Jeff, Stuart, Ruth, and others say, you said that name calling isn't a way to win elections, talking about Kamala Harris in her interview, saying what she did about Trump. But they say, well, that's all Trump does. He name calls bully. How come it works for Republicans, not for Democrats? Although what's implied in that question is that it doesn't hurt Trump. Because you could also argue that it doesn't help Trump, maybe it hurts him, but he's able to compensate for that in other areas. So how do you see it?
Well, I mean, as I see the 24 election, it wasn't that Trump won, it's the Democrats lost. They lost because they got behind a clearly incapacitated or semi capacitated, if that's a word, candidate, and then they anointed a politically incompetent successor, and on top of an administration that had a very mixed record, and that allowed Trump to stage his comeback. By the way, even if name calling does work, is that really what the Democratic Party brand wants to be? Just calling your opponent a four-letter or seven-letter word all the time? I think Democrats can be much better than that. And I think at the end of the day, classiness and good temperament and good sense are your best calling cards, not simply being able to get into the dirt with Donald Trump. And you've been calling him the opponents of Trump have been calling Trump a fascist at the top of their lungs for 10 years now, for 10 years. Guess what? It isn't working. And as Albert Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and thinking it's finally going to work.
Bret, thank you so much for being with us this evening. We appreciate it very much. Look forward to talking with you again in the future.
It's an honor. Thank you so much for a great interview, Larry. And thanks to the whole team, and with a memory of David Lair of blessed memory.
Yes, indeed, of David Lair. Thanks again for terrific viewer questions. They're just the heart of these conversations, these kinds of outstanding questions from people watching our programs. Want to thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for being part of America at a Crossroads, and we'd ask you to please support these weekly programs with your donation to the nonprofit Jews United for Democracy and Justice, which puts these programs on each and every week. Go to the website JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org to make that contribution. We thank you for your generous support, which makes the programs possible. Next Wednesday, another stellar guest, one of America's most heralded historians, Douglas Brinkley. My friend Pat Morrison leads the conversation, titled The American Presidency, A Presidential Historian's Perspective. That's next Wednesday, May 7th, 5 p.m. Pacific. For Janice, Zev, and Mel, I'm Larry Mantle. Good night.